All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Welcome to the Norman A. Sugarman Tax Lecture for the 2016 season. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of this law school, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you for today's lecture, which is going to be really incredible. Today, David Rosenblum is going to address one of the most important current issues in international relations. That is how multinational companies avoid paying income tax. In the past 6 months, this issue has been featured in front pages in major newspapers around the world. Let me quote from a recent article in the Financial Times. So the article says, the uproar about Google paying the United Kingdom $130 million in back taxes and raising the amount it pays in future by just $10 million a year is merely a local difficulty compared with what will come next. Apple could soon be instructed to pay billions, triggering a showdown between Europe and the United States and a potential breakdown of the international tax system. This sounds apocalyptic, but it is a decent bet. Countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, have spent 2 years trying to fix the system. But one of the first results, that is Google's deal, has gone down terribly, end quote. Well, this is the subject of Professor Rosenblum's talk, the BEPS project, which stands for Based Erosion and Profit Shifting, or the eroding of the corporate tax base in countries with income taxes and the shifting of their profits to countries with little or no income tax. I will now turn the lecture over to Richard Gordon, who is a wonderful colleague. He is the Associate Director of our Cox International Law Center. He's the director of our newly launched and about to begin Masters of Financial Integrity. He is an expert with 14 years at the IMF and has recently been working with the United Nations on counterterrorism financing. And he's one of the most loved figures in our law school, and he organized this event, and it's my great pleasure to turn it over to him to introduce the speaker. Richard? Thank you very much. Mike.
That cost me $150. So I'm just going to briefly introduce David Rosenblum. We were figuring we've known each other for about 30 years. He is I have to read this, the James S. Eustace Visiting Professor of Practice and Taxation and Director of the International Tax Program at New York University School of Law. I have to read it because you've taught so many places, including at our alma mater at Harvard. And before I go further and briefly mention his education and past experience, I will say he truly is the greatest living international tax scholar and practitioner, although except for other present company excluded, of course, for some of you. But I really truly mean that. He graduated from Princeton, naturally summa cum laude. Harvard Law School didn't make summa because only one person has graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, I think, in the past 50 years, Lou Sargentich. So that's basically summa cum laude. President of the Harvard Law Review. He clerked for Abe Fortas when he was on the Supreme Court and was an assistant to Arthur Goldberg at the UN, which is something I didn't know. As I say, has taught at just about every place you can imagine, has worked all over the world, has served as a consultant to the OECD, USAID, and the World Bank. And actually, we co-taught a course many years ago for the OECD, I think, in Istanbul, where some friend of yours sold me a carpet, as I recall. Before that, he served as International Tax Counsel and Director of the Office of International Tax Affairs at the U.S. Treasury Department, and is currently a partner at Kaplan and Drysdale. So, David, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for the invitation to you and to the other members of the organizing crew here at Case Western. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you and to deliver this lecture about a subject that I lecture on quite frequently. It's going to be focused eventually on the BEPS project, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, which is the project that was started by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris in 2013, and which led to publication of literally thousands of pages of materials on the 15 action items that are comprise BEPS. And I'm not going to go through all of those because, frankly, I think it's a little boring to go through all of them, but they're generally designed to coordinate international tax rules and to achieve something of a common understanding in 15 areas. Actually, there are fewer than 15 because 3 of the areas deal with transfer pricing. And I would say that in general, they are designed to plug holes in the so-called international tax system. And I'll get back to BEPS in a moment. What I really want to go to today is not just BEPS. And by the way, I'd be happy to take questions either as I speak or later. If you want to ask anything, I'd be delighted to respond to questions. I'm not going to talk solely about BEPS, but about a subject that I talk about quite frequently and am asked about quite frequently, which is what does BEPS mean for the United States? And that's quite a different subject. The United States is, of course, a member of the OECD. We were heavily involved, or at least present, in all the deliberations that led to the papers that came out of the BEPS project, and we're still involved with the implementation of BEPS, so that, to some extent at least, the United States has been present for all of that, but the implications for the United States are somewhat limited, and I have to take a little bit of a detour, and I hope I'm not saying things that you already know, to go through what's currently going on in the United States Congress insofar as international taxation is concerned. For at least as long as the BEPS project has been underway, the Congress has been talking about international tax reform, or sometimes corporate tax reform, or tax reform generally. And there's still a huge amount of discussion. I was called today by a journalist asking about the latest statements coming out of Mr. Brady and the Ways and Means Committee as to whether there will be tax reform. There are a lot of problems with tax reform in the United States today, not the least of which is the level of acrimony and mistrust on Capitol Hill generally. That, of course, since tax is a white-hot area, you can expect that to be to suffer from that problem. But one of my colleagues has a little list of the reasons why tax reform is so difficult. And I like the list, so I'm going to start with that. First of all, there's no general agreement on what tax reform means. The multinational community equates tax reform with tax reduction. Perhaps the business community generally equates tax reform with tax reduction. Some people think of tax reform as an effort striving for simplicity, which I would certainly endorse, but which is always very difficult to achieve. There are genuine questions about whether tax reform should be revenue neutral, or revenue gaining, or revenue losing. And that's very much up for grabs, that issue. The problem is that almost anything you do in the tax area, and I'm going to limit myself to the international tax area for the moment, is going to have winners and losers. And while the winners will be happy to win, the losers will not be happy at all to lose, and they have many lobbyists, and Congress responds to the lobbyists. So it's difficult politically at the micro level to get anything done. It's also true that eliminating tax preferences in the international area is not enough to fund any huge reductions. So you have to think pretty large if you're going to do something here. There's a decent chance that anything that's done would hurt the U.S. manufacturing sector. It's not clear that there are macro benefits from tax reform, notwithstanding what some economists say. Everything, I think, is fairly unclear about that, and there's also the possibility that there will be foreign country reactions to anything that we do, so that if we lower our rate, the chances are that other countries will lower their rates even more. It's also true, I think, that there's not much broad public interest in international tax reform, and there's the political problem of doing something for multinational companies when individuals are themselves, at least some of them, are complaining about the situation. So there's lots and lots of problems with getting anything done, and notwithstanding an awful lot of rhetoric that comes out of Capitol Hill about how Mr. Brady, for example, has said that he intends to do tax reform this year, which you may have noticed is an election year. I don't think those of us who follow this material really think that's in the cards. So in thinking about BEPS and what we can do in response to the various recommendations of BEPS, and I'll come to some of the highlight recommendations in a moment, I have pretty much assumed that legislative action in the Congress of the United States is not going to be forthcoming. I could be surprised. I've been surprised by Congress in the past, but as I used to tell my bosses when I was at the Treasury, if you put your chips on the square on the table that says Congress will do nothing, you will eventually leave the table with a great wealth in your pocket. Independently of that, and this is perhaps less well known except to those of us who follow this stuff on a daily basis, independently of the inability to get legislation, tax legislation, through the Congress, we have a serious problem in the United States with tax treaties. And that's because one senator of the United States, Senator Rand Paul, has basically precluded the United States Senate from taking up treaties by voice vote. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, so let me explain what he's done. It's not that he's put a hold on treaties, as is sometimes reported. What's happened is that the way the Senate deals with tax treaties, which they don't regard as being terribly important, but which many multinationals and others do regard as important, what the Senate has usually done is the treaties are referred, when they get up to the Hill, to the Foreign Relations Committee. Foreign Relations Committee does a report, does whatever it does on the treaties, and the treaties are sent up to the Senate floor, where historically they're taken up in a group by unanimous consent following the recommendations of the Foreign Relations Committee. What Senator Paul has done has been to preclude unanimous consent to take up the treaties on the Senate floor. So he's in the Foreign Relations Committee, and he gets to speak and to voice his concerns, which have a lot to do with the exchange of information under treaties. It's not entirely clear to me what his problem is. He talks about information exchange provisions in the treaties as being an invasion of privacy, which is a little strange to be worried about the privacy of people keeping accounts in Zurich. I think it's kind of ironic, I just say this in passing, that inside the United States, the Revenue Service has huge power to go to bank accounts and get information. They can literally go on fishing expeditions. So Senator Paul is in the weird position of being more tighter and wanting a more strict rule with respect to information that's maintained in Zurich than information that's maintained in Louisville. And that strikes me as bizarre for a senator from Kentucky, but hey, I'm just an observer. Any event, he shows no indication of relenting. He's still up there. He ran for president, as I'm sure you know, and he's back on the Hill. He's young. He's going to be around for a while. He has basically brought the process, the normal process on the Hill, to a halt as of November of 2011. So we're into our fourth year with nothing happening on the treaties, and some of our treaty partners don't really understand what's going on. The Japanese have been waiting for their protocol to be approved. And as you probably know, under the Constitution, you can't put a treaty in effect without the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, Senator Paul hasn't completely precluded action on the treaties, and I mention all this because it's all relevant to BEPS. I'll come back to tying this into BEPS. He hasn't precluded action on the treaties. The treaties could still be taken up, but just not by unanimous consent. The problem there, the difficulty there, is that under the rules of the Senate, which are not widely known. Um, uh, each treaty is allotted a full day of debate. There are, I think, 9 treaties now waiting to be approved by the Senate, and there is just no way on God's green earth that the Senate of the United States is going to spend 9 legislative days on tax treaties. So that's where we are. His refusal to agree to unanimous consent has basically left everything in abeyance. There's been an awful lot of talk about changing that, but unless the Senate either takes up the treaties one by one or somehow figures out a way to get around Senator Paul, we're stuck with no treaty. So we can't. So we're in the odd position facing BEPS and the recommendations of the OECD that we can't do anything legislatively as a practical matter, and we can't do anything by treaty either. So we're in a funny position, which the world does not fully appreciate. So what is BEPS? Well, BEPS has 15 action items, and I asked that 2 handouts be given you. I don't know if you received them. One is just a short outline, but probably a better, although a little bit out of date, discussion is in an article that I did on reflections of the intersection of treaty policy, U.S. tax reform, and BEPS. And in that article, I list the 15 action items. Some of the best-known action items are number 2, which is the neutralizing the effects of hybrid mismatch arrangements. That would be where you've got one country considers an entity to be transparent and the other considers it to be non-transparent. And sophisticated tax planning can produce a situation where you get a deduction in one country and no inclusion in the other country, or you get a double deduction. That's one of the highlight action items. Action item 6 is a series of recommendations on preventing treaty abuse. That's one that we are largely compliant with already, as I'll explain in a moment, but in any event, we can't do anything about our treaties, so it's hopeless to go there. Action items 8, 9, and 10 are all transfer pricing action items. And I want to make clear that the BEPS materials here run to literally thousands of pages, and there's an awful lot of very turgid text in there, and also there's a lot of things in those materials that they're easy to interpret in different ways, and people will interpret them in different ways. I would say that the transfer pricing action items, 8, 9, and 10, can be viewed as sort of the core of BEPS in a sense. They've certainly got, if not the most attention, probably among the action items that have gotten the most attention. And they require that income be allocated to the country where value is created. And that sounds great. To me, it sounds great. It sounds like a not unreasonable thing to require, but there's plenty of room for debate about where value is created. And I like to cite in this regard an example that a tax director who happened to actually commenting on came by my office to talk about this article and gave me an example, which I think is a fair example. Just south of the border with Mexico, there are a bunch of companies, factories, Maquiladora program, where the Mexicans manufacture goods for shipment back into the United States. So the example posited by this tax director was, well, we have a factory which is using all Mexican products and all Mexican labor. The land is in Mexico, obviously. Everything about the manufacture of these products is in Mexico, but the only market for the products is the United States. So where is the value created there? Now, you can see that countries, which we have to assume are going to follow their national interests, the U.S. is going to say, and there are a lot of countries that could be put in this position, that the value is in the U.S. That's where the market is. On the other hand, we can readily assume that the Mexicans are going to say, what do you mean the value is in the U.S.? All the manufacturing activity is taking place in Mexico. There's a lot of ambiguity in the things that the OECD said. But in any event, that's 8, 9, and 10. Let me continue with a couple of other action items that I wanted to cite. One, because I'll come back to these, there are several action items that have to do with information. Um, uh, Requiring taxpayers, number 12, to disclose their aggressive tax planning arrangements, and re-examining transfer pricing documentation, establishing methodologies to collect and analyze data on BEPS. There are a number of action items that go to disclosure of one sort or another. Then action item 14, which is one I also will return to, which I think is important, and it's the one hope for the multinational community that this whole project will not create just disastrous consequences. Action item 14 is to make the dispute resolution mechanism more effective. I'll come back to that. That's significant. And the final one I want to mention, there's a whole list in the article, is develop a multinational instrument, because BEPS implies that there's going to be a complete sea change in international tax rules throughout the world, and since there are thousands of treaties in existence, you need to have a mechanism for implementing the new rules without running afoul of treaty commitments. And the idea is that the countries will develop a multilateral text that all countries can sign on to and ratify in their home countries, and thereby put in place this new world international tax order. The United States was very reluctant to participate in that, although they have decided ultimately to at least sit at the table. In my judgment, there's not much chance that anything like that could even receive a hearing in the Senate of the United States, but we'll see. We'll see. So let me tell you generally where I think this is and where I think it's going from the standpoint of the United States. There are some aspects of BEPS that don't require us to do anything because they're borrowed from things that we've done for years. That's particularly clear in the treaty area, action item 6. A number of the ways of combating abuse are ways that we have implemented in the United States for decades. In our treaties, we've got provisions to counter treaty shopping, the borrowing of tax treaties, and now BEPS is finally caught up with that and recommended it. And the OECD will undoubtedly make changes in the OECD model and the commentary on the OECD model that will reflect that. We don't have to do much of anything to comply with things that we already are in compliance with. But the bigger issue, I think, is that overall, if you step back from BEPS, and this is the most important point, the general tendency is to enhance the ability of the country of source to impose taxation. And if you think about the Google case, which was mentioned earlier, or Apple, or many, a lot of the cases that have attracted the headlines, they're basically techniques, by and large, for siphoning income out of countries, source countries, countries where sales are made, countries where business is being done, and into low tax havens. And this is now my perspective. This is not something that is said in BEPS, but I think it's true. For years, decades, the United States basically went along with that because it benefited our multinationals, particularly some of our high-tech and pharmaceutical companies. And over a period of time, the irritation of a lot of other countries began to grow, and so I think that is something that really fed into BEPS. Any event, BEPS can be viewed as revenge of the source countries. So I think of the world, the international tax world, as being this ongoing tension between the country of residence and the country of source. There's nothing, it's not that I invented that. That goes back to work that was done in the League of Nations in the 1920s, and that's all the way forward. And our model treaty, the OECD model treaty, the UN model treaty, all of these can be analyzed in terms of how does the source country do vis-a-vis the residence country. And we, historically, in the United States, have always viewed ourselves primarily, indeed almost uniquely, as a residence country. So we view the world from the standpoint of capital export. And that's been true, that's true in our statutory law. If you go back over the last 50 years, enormous amounts of effort have been expended on the taxation of the U.S. multinational community. How should the United States tax what we call outbound investment? That's been the focus of Congress. In fact, there are books written called International Taxation, where the only subject taken up is outbound taxation. It sometimes seems to me as though, as a country, from the tax angle, international tax angle, we are permanently fixed in about 1946 or 1947, where we ruled the world, our companies were the most powerful everywhere, and the only subject to pay attention to was, well, how are we going to tax these huge U.S. multinationals? Well, that's pretty far from current reality, where inbound investment pretty much matches outbound investment on a year-by-year basis. So we are a gigantic inbound country in the United States. But we have not changed our rules with respect to investments in the United States by foreign investors really since 1966. So we're in our 50th year of the Foreign Investors Tax Act, which has been amended only in fairly minor ways since then, and in many respects is outmoded. It's certainly neglected. I would add also, aside from it being neglected statutorily, the Revenue Service has not done a particularly good job in educating its employees to investigate inbound taxation. So the inbound rules, with some exceptions, the banks, the foreign banks in the United States get regularly audited. But I don't think you would find too many international agent, i.e. international examiners, with knowledge of the inbound rules, which are not as complicated as the outbound rules and which require, to some extent, a lot of judgment, which the Revenue Service is not particularly good at. In any event, into this United States world, heavily oriented toward residence taxation, you have BEPS. BEPS drops in now in 2015 after 2 years, and I think the general theme of BEPS, if you cut through the thousands and thousands of pages, is to say to source countries, there are various things you can do to enhance your take of revenue. And that's what I think is going to happen. I think that since BEPS is subject to interpretation, and there's, as I said earlier, a great deal of verbiage which can be interpreted according to the wishes of the interpreter, I would expect to see countries around the world, and I already do see countries around the world, enhancing their laws related to inbound investment in their borders in the name of complying with BEPS. So, for example, the Mexicans were first out of the block, as far as I know. They started passing laws that were supposedly BEPS compliant and enhancing tax take even before the reports were written. The Australians have done it. The French have done it. The Canadians have talked about it. Germany's done it to some extent. The United Kingdom has done it. And they've all passed laws, not all the same, by the way, but which I think overall are apt to result in greater taxation of U.S. investment in their countries. So if there's a threat to the Googles and the Apples and the Ubers and all of the IT people, it's going to come not so much from the United States, because again, I don't see Congress doing much of anything, but it will come, I think, from foreign countries. And there are treaty arrangements with those countries, and some of those new examinations, new laws in those countries are going to raise interesting and challenging treaty issues, and I'll come back to that in a second. We, in the United States, have been largely a bystander in the BEPS process. BEPS has been going on since 2013, and The Treasury, with Bob Stack, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International, highest-ranking international tax lawyer in the U.S. in the U.S. executive branch. Bob and his staff have been in Paris regularly dealing with the BEPS process and trying, I think, and meeting with some criticism for trying to defend the interests of the U.S. multinational communities, because I think it is not unfair to say that BEPS is, to a certain extent, targeted at the United States. The people who did BEPS, Pascal Saint-Amand, the leaders of the OECD, would deny that vociferously, but it's hard not to read the BEPS phenomenon as being completely unrelated to the practices, fairly aggressive practices of U.S. multinationals. I should add that there really aren't any heroes in this, because the U.S. multinationals, it's easy to say in hindsight, were very aggressive in what they did in some of these countries, and you sort of wonder from, again, in hindsight, how they could have expected to siphon tax out of the likes of Germany and France and other countries and not get some kind of, eventually, some kind of a public reaction, which is what they're getting now. So Bob was out there doing his best to participate, to defend the U.S. interests in the BEPS project. Congress was absent for a very, very long time. I mean, Congress paid zero attention, and you didn't see much in the way of public debate. The one item that the Treasury feels, I think correctly, can be done under BEPS, and Treasury has done, is to put out something, a template for what we call country-by-country reporting. So that this will require large companies throughout the world, but of course there are a lot of U.S. companies in that universe, to report with some degree of accuracy where their profits are coming from. And when we see, 75% of your profits in the Cayman Islands, that's going to be a problem. And so companies are fearful, and I think justifiably fearful of this. And when that was being discussed, this goes back now about 6 months, finally, Congress woke up, and Senator Hatch, and then, I guess it was then Mr. Ryan at Ways and Means, wrote a series of letters saying that the Treasury should not go along with this country-by-country reporting. It should not require country-by-country reporting. It didn't have the authority to require country-by-country reporting. Treasury didn't pay much attention to that. And one of the problems here that I think we're going to have to come to terms with is it doesn't really much matter what the U.S. Congress does. Even if they stop this, it wouldn't stop the likes of France and Germany and the United Kingdom from getting the information they want, because our companies have to operate within those countries. So there's only so much that can be done, and I think that stamping the floor and pounding the table is really not going to put a halt to the BEPS situation. So I think that what's going to happen from all of this is that we're going to have new rules in many countries. The rules are not necessarily going to be consistent or coherent. And we're going to get fairly aggressive examinations, and we're going to see some serious disputes. Now, this is where the action item 14 comes in. Action item 14 is the item on make dispute resolution mechanisms more effective. And I think from the standpoint of the U.S. multinational community, if we were able to make dispute resolution under treaties more effective, this would go a long way toward countering what I see as a slow-motion train wreck as a result of BEPS. In other words, I see many disputes coming down the pike, but if we had a means of resolving those disputes in a rational way, that would be good, and I think I know the multinational community would applaud. And fortunately, the United States, I don't know how many of you followed this, but the United States, about 12 years ago, I think it is 12 years ago, had a change of heart on probably the most significant aspect of U.S. treaty policy in the last, I don't know how many years, when we adopted mandatory arbitration under tax treaties. So as of 2004, I think I have the date right, we adopted mandatory arbitration in treaties with Germany and Belgium, and we subsequently adopted them with France, and most significantly of all, Canada. And that made the possibility, that made treaties into basically a quasi-adjudicatory instrument. So if you entered into a treaty with another country with mandatory arbitration, and you had the ability, you knew as a taxpayer or indeed as an administrator, that there would be a means of resolving the dispute to avoid double taxation down the road, that's a real game changer. It didn't matter so much with Germany, which never was much of an issue for us. And it didn't matter so much for Belgium because we didn't have many cases with Belgium. And in any event, the Belgians did what you would expect a rational country to do when confronted with mandatory arbitration, which is that long-standing disputes, there were a couple of them, were immediately resolved once mandatory arbitration was on the table. And we've never had any arbitrations with Germany or Belgium or France. But Canada is a different story. We have a large inventory of disputes with Canada, and there's been, in recent years, and by recent I'm going back 15 years, there's been very bad history of resolving double tax cases. Part of it is that we're just too close to the Canadians. Part of it is that there's a lot of chip on the shoulder sort of attitudes, and the CRA, that's the Canada Revenue Agency, has a tendency to set up examination results that really are unsustainable. So we have had some arbitrations with Canada. But the good news is that the arbitration method that was chosen was baseball arbitration, which is sometimes referred to as last clear chance arbitration. Baseball arbitration, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but I think it's frankly brilliant, because the objection to arbitration is that it's an infringement on the sovereignty of a country. But under baseball arbitration, the arbitration panel, and it's a three-person panel, gets the last offer from each side, and they are empowered only to choose one side or the other. They can't make up their own minds, they can't write opinions. Their decision is a number, and it's not precedential. So their power is quite limited. It's limited by what the countries come forward with. And that, of course, has a tendency to make countries more realistic in what they propose. So I'm a big fan of baseball arbitration. I think that the initial concerns that it was an infringement on sovereignty because you had outside parties deciding tax liabilities rather than a U.S. government official, I think that is dissipated. By the way, all the arbitrations with Canada, and it's a state secret how many there have been. You more easily find out nuclear secrets than how many arbitrations there have been with Canada, but they've all been won by the United States. And that's because CRA it's taken them a long time to get the memo, simply. Any event, now, how does this tie in with BEPS? Well, BEPS, the multinational community was hoping that BEPS would come forward with a strong recommendation of arbitration, mandatory arbitration, but BEPS did not. The report did not. However, there is a so-called coalition of the willing of 21, I think it's 21 and maybe 24 countries that are prepared to do mandatory arbitration. And in the new U.S. Model Income Tax Convention, which was just released last month, the United States has included a mandatory arbitration provision. So we are moving strongly as we can without a legislature behind us, to push toward mandatory arbitration. That's the good news. And that would go a long way to undoing the sense of concern that you feel in the multinational community when BEPS is discussed. So where does that all leave us? And my talk here was supposed to be, what would a rational United States do? I think if you think large here, if you think large about what the United States could do. And I think I may have a slide on this. No, I didn't include a slide on this. But if you think large about what's going on, BEPS was the most significant development in international taxation, probably in 30 or 40 years at least. I mean, this is a huge development because, not because it's going to achieve consensus, which it won't, not because it's got clear rules, which it doesn't have. A lot of the BEPS proposals, for example, in the hybrid mismatch area are mindlessly complicated, and they will never be implemented by countries who barely understand what a hybrid mismatch is. But what BEPS has done has been to raise the awareness of international taxation around the world. I don't go anywhere, and I mean anywhere in the world, that people are unaware of BEPS. I go to countries in Africa, I go to countries in South America. People are aware of this project, and it's going to seep through into practical action. So what's the United States to do as a rational country? I personally think that there are really only three options. And the first one is what Congress has been doing pretty much all along, which is to do nothing. And doing nothing, I think, is a formula for real problems. I would like to say that if I lived in a country where, you know, everybody was rowing in the same direction, we'd have some kind of a discussion of what makes sense in light of this project, which, as I've indicated earlier, is to some extent aimed at the United States. What is the right U.S. response to this circumstance? We're not going to be able to stop it by congressional fiat, so what else can we do? Well, I think doing nothing is one thing we can do. I don't think it's a great idea. The other thing we can do is we can double down on our historic position that we are a residence country, and residence taxation is the way to go. And let me explain how we got there. We got to favoring residence taxation. There are two strains of thought that made us a residence country. And by residence country, I mean in the eternal debate between source country and residence country, and every country is both, we come down very hard on the side of residence. And we do it for two reasons. We do it, one, for a perfectly benign tax policy reason, and we do it, secondly, because of selfishness. Let's take selfishness first. Coming out of World War II, our view was, you know, the companies are all U.S. companies. If we favor residence taxation, that means more tax revenue for us, less taxes on our companies. Our companies will benefit. We'll benefit as a country. You can see all sorts of reasons why, viewing the world as we did in the 40s and 50s, and even well into the 60s, it made sense to favor residence taxation. The other reason for the preference for residence taxation is a less selfish reason, a much more benign reason, which is that if you're worried about double taxation or multiple taxation, the country of residence is in the best position to avoid that, because the source country only sees the slice of income that takes place within its borders, right? So certain industries, shipping and air, for example, if you allowed source basis taxation of those industries, you get very, very high effective tax rates. And the United States has historically fought that. There are countries in the world, particularly in Asia, and particularly with shipping, which have a tendency to want to tax U.S. shipping and U.S. container traffic and things like that. And that ends up with multiple countries taxing. It's very hard for a source country to avoid double taxation or multiple taxation. Residence country can do it. The residence country, by definition, sees worldwide income, and it can figure out a way to avoid double taxation. So both of those strains contribute to our preference for residence taxation. And there are three major, from a U.S. perspective, three major model tax treaties out there, which is the OECD model, which traces its roots back to the League of Nations. OECD is an international organization based in Paris. Its Committee on Fiscal Affairs is the Tax Committee. It has always been a rich guys club. It started out as the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, And then in the 60s, we and the Aussies and the Japanese joined, and it became more of a world organization. And more recently, the OECD has been going in the direction of democratizing. It's admitted the likes of Mexico and Chile and Israel and a few other countries. Some other countries are observers. So the OECD has been broadening membership, but it still has a relatively small membership by comparison with the world. And the OECD model is a residence-based model. So that is to say, it gives preference to the residence country. It asks the source country to reduce tax. The UN, the United Nations model, and the UN Tax Committee is a rising element in this field. The UN is much more oriented toward source countries, as you might imagine. A lot of the population of the United Nations are developing countries who see them don't have much of a residence tax base to tax. They don't have a lot of export of capital, and they import capital, so they want more tax in the source country. So they develop their own model, and it's based on the OECD model, but it's distinctly more oriented toward the country of source. We, on the other hand, and we've had a model since 1976, are even beyond the OECD in favoring the residence country. And our most recent model, which, as I said, came out a month ago, is along the same lines. We have not changed our basic orientation toward the country of residence as opposed to the country of source. So if you could go through the U.S. model and tick off all the elements in the model where we go even beyond the OECD in favoring the country of residence, and actually there are things that we do in our treaty practice that we didn't put in our model, like agreeing to a zero rate at source on dividends in some cases, which we now have in more than 20 of our treaties. That's even beyond anything the OECD would imagine doing. So we're still in that direction. So second possible reaction to BEPS from the United States is to double down on our policy. And our method of going to the world historically has been to go to the countries where our companies were investing and to say, you really don't want to be too aggressive in your taxation of our companies because, you know, you'll deter investment. Our companies won't want to invest in you. And we've tried that over the years with greater or lesser success. It's certainly been our policy in treaties. We've tried to we don't necessarily ask for developing countries to sign on to the U.S. model, but we do ask them to give up tax at source in favor of the residence country. We make all the arguments that it's good for you to give up tax at source. We're telling you a policy that's in your interest. I don't think that story works anymore, and I think that's what BEPS tells us. The Brazilians, they don't care what we think about their policy should be, nor do the Indians, nor do the Chinese. Those are three of the big countries where we have to do business, where we have huge amounts of U.S. investment. And so I think the idea of going out and telling these countries, reduce your tax at source and we'll take care of the double tax at home, that story's getting a little long in the tooth. I don't think that's going to be terribly successful. So what might we do? Well, I think that what the Brazilians and the Indians, to some extent the Chinese, are saying to the world is, look, we have markets. Your people are going to be, you're going to invest in India, you're going to invest in China, you're going to invest in Brazil no matter what we do. Yes, it's true, we can't be too aggressive, but leave that to us. We'll figure out what we should do. We'll try and find the balance without your great help, United States, in figuring out what the right balance is between an appropriate level of taxation on inbound investment and scaring off investors altogether. Some of these countries, I mean, left to their own devices, India's a great example, can be extremely aggressive. They don't worry too much about scaring off investment. Or I shouldn't say that. They go in zigs and zags. But by and large, there are long periods of time when they profess not to be concerned. I think we should take a leaf from their book. I think what the United States should do is seriously think about inbound investment. It's almost impossible to get Congress to think about it, but I think we have been way too generous to inbound investment, and that the reason that we're seeing these inversions, which you read about now in the mainstream press, the reason that a Pfizer or one of these other companies, Medtronic, the reason they go abroad is not to avoid the U.S. tax on the foreign earnings, which is what they profess to be doing. There isn't much U.S. tax on the foreign earnings, and it's controllable. So that's not what they're trying to do. What they're really trying to do is to become a foreign company so that they can take advantage of the generosity that we extend to foreign companies in the United States. And that's something we really need to think hard about. The lobbyists for the foreign companies scare Congress by saying, if you raise the tax on us so that we pay more in the United States, we'll invest less and it'll cost you jobs in your district. And Congress runs for the exit. And there may be, there's always a germ of truth in these kinds of statements. But I don't think the U.S. market is going anywhere any more than the Brazilian market is going anywhere. And this tax planning that we read about in the press, let's face it, you've got some of the smartest people in the country doing tax planning 24/7. They're smarter than the other side, and there are more of them. We're not going to outdo them in developing anti-abuse rules that's going to shut everything down. But I think what we ought to be doing is we ought to be raising to some extent the tax level on inbound investment. From the way I see it, that's fairly easy money. I don't think we're going to scare people out of the United States. And I think that we ought to have the courage to see that we could raise our taxes to a more reasonable level without scaring off all this investment. And without losing jobs. I don't think people are going to walk away from the U.S. market no matter what. So that's what seems to me to be a rational approach. And the article, which I hope was distributed, if it's not, if you want somebody contact me, I'll send you a copy of it. I was focused on treaty policy, but you can't do that without changing the statute. That statute hasn't been looked at on inbound for 50 years. If we want to deal more with inversions, or the Achilles heel in our international tax policy now is that we vastly overemphasized the rules on outbound taxation and completely neglected the rules on inbound taxation without realizing that the two of them are linked. Particularly when it's very easy for a company to become a foreign company. That's child's play to invert. Even with all this statutory nonsense that we've put in place in the Internal Revenue Code. We've got technical rules and notices and regulations. People figure out a way around it. That's how Pfizer is going abroad. But if we raise the barrier on U.S. investment by foreign companies, I think we'd get some revenue, and I think it would deter a certain degree of inversions. All right, so what I'm saying is that I think BEPS should really be a catalyst for rethinking of U.S. international tax rules. I don't have all the answers, but in a rational country, if we were approaching this the way, for example, the country that I'm most familiar with approaches tax policy outside the United States, which is Canada, they engage in a genuine intellectual process. They bring in the business community, they have academics, they have legislators, and they try to figure out what's right. They don't get it always right, but their whole process, it strikes me, is admirable compared to the process that we've been engaged in. And I just think BEPS is an opportunity for us. It's a chance for us to do something if we could all get together. Finally, I do think that there are all sorts of implications, even if we do nothing for coming out of BEPS, because there's so much commentary on so many international tax rules. I think inevitably a lot of this is going to seep into our court cases. I think our judges are going to start citing to the BEPS materials. I think the OECD materials they're already cited a lot in our cases, in our treaty cases. We don't have that many treaty cases, but when they come up, the OECD work is cited more and more. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, but now it is the case. So I think BEPS is sort of permeates this whole area. It's not so much the specifics of what they say, but the fact that they say so much. And where it goes is very much in the eye of the beholder. So that's what I came here to tell you about today. That's where I see us going. That's what I think BEPS is all about. It is really the most significant thing we've had in a long time. So if anyone has any questions or comments or wants to talk about any of this or tax reform, I'd be delighted. Yes, sir.
Donald Trump claims that he's going to scour China and do all these other things. In a trade war, let's say with Europe, who do you think would win? Not that there's usually any winners in a war, but
Well, a trade war wouldn't help anybody. It would be bad for everybody. I don't think, I don't credit that he's going to do any of that. I actually think Donald Trump would be probably pretty good for the Internal Revenue Service. You know why? Because Donald Trump is a businessman, and any business where you spend $1 and you get a return of 8, which is what the Revenue Service does, I think he'll be responsive to that. That's my guess. Yeah. Matt.
With BEPS being a number of recommendations, but obviously not having legislative power, that it would seem that at some point where the rubber's going to meet the road is when countries start to enact BEPS-inspired laws based on the recommendations. Do you have any guess on a time frame window of when we might see first, middle, last implementing legislation?
In
under
other
BEPS?
countries?
Yeah.
Oh, it's already taken place. That's what I mentioned. The Mexicans did it before the ink was dry, actually before the proposals were made. You may not have heard of these. I don't know. The Australians adopted something called what they call the Netflix tax. Britain has adopted something called the Diverted Profits Tax. Canada is considering rules. Britain is also, hybrid mismatch legislation has just been proposed in the British Parliament. The French have adopted some rules. The Germans have, it's going on. And generally what you get is, whatever it is, the countries say, well, this is consistent with BEPS. I think Canada's definitely going to be doing something. See, it's hard for us to appreciate how much more important the OECD is in these countries than it is in the United States. I mean, it's an afterthought at best in the United States. To be honest with you, outside of Bob Stack in the Treasury, there's only one other person I know in the entire country who has really followed this stuff carefully, and that's Carol Doran Klein at the U.S. Council for International Business. She's done a fantastic job of summarizing all of the developments, but I'm not sure how big her audience is. I think inside the multinational companies, there are probably people who are following BEPS to some extent. But there's not been a whole lot of attention paid. Other countries, when the OECD says something, it really is meaningful to them. Yes.
The United States was embroiled in litigation twice in the WTO, having to do with the Foreign Sales Corporation issue.
Yeah.
As you identified correctly, the United States taxes the income of U.S. corporations wherever made,
Right.
which is quite different from the rest of the world. And the Foreign Sales Corporation was the artifact that the United States found to basically exempt some of those earnings abroad through the creation of these vehicles. And that was deemed by the WTO, in my opinion, unfairly, to be a subsidy, an export, a subsidy, which is basically illegal under, not WTO compatible under
Right.
GATT and the SCM agreement in the newer incarnation. As BEPS, the BEPS system gets applied by more countries, do you foresee a potential trade litigation or this coming before the WTO as a trade issue?
I have not heard that actually, but it sort of depends on what countries do. Now, let me give you a clear example. The Brits have adopted this diverted profits tax, which is a very strange tax. And it looks to me to be potentially quite discriminatory. Now, I would say it's discriminatory under the US-UK treaty, except the British answer is it's a separate tax and it's not covered by the US-UK treaty. I'm not sure that's an adequate defense, but if countries do that, enact rules which are targeted at inbound investments, I can see the potential for some trade legislation, trade litigation. I don't know how it would come out, but I can see that. That British tax, that DPT, is really a very aggressive move, and it's clearly aimed at inbound investment, and I would say fairly clearly aimed at U.S. multinationals. You know, earlier we were talking about Google and Amazon. Well, Amazon wasn't mentioned, but you might as well mention Amazon and Apple and Starbucks and all that. All of that is, you know, we complain. I mean, you're in a funny world here. We complain that it's aimed at U.S. multinationals. The European Union would say, no, that's not aimed at U.S. multinationals. That's all state aid investigation. Well, I think it is aimed at U.S. multinationals. But guess what? It's because U.S. multinationals were the most aggressive ones on the planet. To the extent other multinationals started undertaking aggressive tax planning, it was we who tutored them. So you know, it's not a very good position on either side on that. And of course, Congress is jumping up and down, wants us to invoke Section 891 of the Internal Revenue Code, which allows, upon a finding of the President of discrimination, allows us to double our tax rates on foreign investment in the United States. Talk about a trade war. We could start a tax war. So I don't think any of that's going to happen. But you hear a lot of very angry voices out there. So, but you know, we don't rule the rest of the world. We haven't ruled it for a long, long time. And somebody ought to write their congressman and tell them that.
Okay, we've run out of time
All right.
for our Q&A session. And
Thank you very much.
There's a reception outside with food and drinks for anyone who'd like to attend and ask Professor Rosenblum some more questions. Thank you.